The sun had barely begun to rise over Iwo Jima, casting an eerie blood-orange glow across the jagged volcanic terrain. From the shadows of camouflaged bunkers and hidden caves, Japanese soldiers peered cautiously at the horizon. For months they had prepared for this day, convinced that their carefully dug trenches, reinforced fortifications, and labyrinthine tunnels could withstand any attack. Confidence ran deep, sharpened by the harsh discipline and the belief that the island's natural defenses were insurmountable. Yet, beneath that confidence, a flicker of unease lingered. The distant rumble was faint at first, a low vibration in the earth that made the men glance nervously at one another. It was the sound of engines, dozens, maybe hundreds, churning across the blackened soil. Some shrugged, trying to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the restless tension that had gripped them for days. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like a predator closing in on its prey, and then they saw it, the first armored vehicles crawling over the ridges, their steel hulls glinting in the early light. At first they seemed ordinary tanks, nothing new. But then the soldiers noticed the nozzles mounted atop the turrets, the thick pipes that promised a death more terrifying than any shell. These were flamethrower tanks, monsters of fire designed to consume and annihilate. Murmurs ran through the ranks: fear, disbelief, a creeping realization that these machines were unlike anything they had faced before. The ground trembled with every engine roar as the tanks advanced. The heat of their flamethrowers a distant promise, yet terrifyingly real. The men crouched in their bunkers, clutching rifles and grenades, hearts pounding, minds racing. Some stared wide-eyed into the approaching inferno, trying to steel themselves. Others prayed silently, gripping their swords and lances, knowing full well that conventional weapons offered little hope against the roaring fire that would soon be unleashed from the cliffs. Lieutenant Nakamura watched his men, reading the tension on their faces. He had trained them well, drilled them in defensive maneuvers, instructed them in the art of deception and ambush. Yet even he could not mask the unease creeping into his own chest. He had heard rumors of these American flamethrower tanks, whispered tales of caves engulfed in flames, soldiers trapped with no escape. He had hoped it was exaggeration. Now, seeing them roll inexorably forward, hope faltered. A distant hiss broke the tension, a prelude to fire, a subtle warning of what was to come. The flamethrowers were ready, the engines primed, the operators calm and focused. From within their steel cages, American soldiers peered through vision slits, knowing their weapons would soon turn the island into a hellscape. The Japanese dug in deeper, fingers tightening around triggers. Breaths caught in anxious anticipation, and then, as the first tank reached the edge of the rocky plateau, a sudden surge of flame leapt from its nozzle, a roaring tongue of fire cutting through the morning mist. The soldiers froze, horror etched into every face. Caves and bunkers, once thought secure, became ovens of unimaginable heat. Smoke twisted skyward, carrying screams that would haunt every man who survived that day. Lieutenant Nakamura gritted his teeth, shouting orders over the chaos, but even his voice sounded small against the roar of fire and steel. The horizon burned, not with the sun's light, but with an inferno that promised to reshape the very definition of war. And in that moment, every soldier understood their battle was no longer just against men, but against a machine that brought fear itself to life. The rumble grew louder, closer, unstoppable. Iwo Jima had awakened to a new horror, and the men bracing themselves in its shadows could only watch, hearts hammering. As the first wave of American flamethrower tanks crept toward them, an unrelenting tide of fire and death, the rumble of engines grew louder, shaking the volcanic ash beneath the Japanese trenches. Smoke curled along the horizon as the first American flamethrower tanks crested the ridges, their steel hulls glinting in the sun. To the men hidden in the labyrinth of bunkers and caves, it was a sound like the apocalypse itself, the mechanical heartbeat of death. Rolling steadily forward, from the rear, orders crackled through the air. American infantry moved in tandem with the tanks, using the machines as both shield and weapon. The tanks' flamethrowers, capable of spewing fire over 30 yards, turned the enemy's strongholds into cages of heat and smoke. Flames leapt from bunker to bunker, devouring wooden supports, thatched roofs, and anything the Japanese had once thought impenetrable. The air thickened with smoke, and the scent of scorched earth mixed with the acrid sting of fear inside one of the hilltop caves. Sergeant Tanaka could only watch in disbelief. It burns everything," he whispered to the men beside him, eyes wide, reflecting the flickering orange light that danced across the rock walls. They had been trained for an American landing, for gunfire and artillery, even for naval bombardment, but nothing like this. The heat seared through the stone in ways that seemed unnatural, as if the fire itself had learned the contours of the caves. Outside, Lieutenant James Parker adjusted his helmet, scanning the battlefield. From his vantage point atop the flamethrower tank, he could see the chaos unfolding. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels, rifles raised, only to recoil as fire engulfed the entrances. Some fired blindly into the smoke, others dropped to the ground, seeking shelter that no longer existed. The American tanks pressed forward relentlessly, each advance more devastating than the last. The first bunker fell with a roar of flames. Wood and stone cracked and splintered, sending debris flying as the men inside screamed. Those who tried to escape were met with machine gun fire, the combined arms attack leaving almost no room to breathe. Panic rippled through the ranks. Soldiers scattered into narrow tunnels, only to find themselves trapped as the fire pursued them relentlessly. Accounts later described it as if the island itself had turned against them, a living inferno that consumed everything in its path. Even the Americans felt the tension. Operating a flamethrower tank was a task of precision under unimaginable stress. One wrong move could ignite friendly positions or leave the crew exposed to sniper fire. Every soldier knew the stakes: advance too slowly and the Japanese could regroup. Too aggressively, and they risked being trapped by the very flames they commanded. Yet for all the danger, there was grim determination etched on every face. The fire was their ally, and it was reshaping the battlefield in real time. In another tunnel system, Corporal Hasegawa pressed himself against the damp stone wall, clutching his rifle as sweat and soot coated his face. How do we fight this?" he muttered under his breath, watching flames lick closer, consuming wooden barricades with relentless efficiency. Even grenades seemed inadequate. The fire pushed deeper into the caves than they could reach, forcing soldiers to retreat further, deeper into the earth. The tunnels that had once offered safety became death traps, corridors of smoke and choking heat that left men gasping for air. Lieutenant Parker's tank rounded a ridge and unleashed another stream of fire. The roar echoed across the battlefield, drowning out screams, gunfire, and the frantic shouts of Japanese officers. Men who had once laughed at the idea of American tanks were now paralyzed by terror, scrambling over rubble and jagged rocks, trying to escape a force they could neither understand nor confront. The combination of fire, smoke, and the psychological terror of the tanks shattered morale in ways traditional artillery never could. Amid the chaos, small acts of courage emerged. A young Japanese soldier, barely 19, carried a wounded comrade to a side tunnel just moments before fire swept through their position. An American crewman remained on his tank, directing flames toward a cave entrance even as bullets ricocheted across the hull. Every action was amplified by desperation, the air thick with tension as both sides fought against overwhelming odds. By midday, the American advance had carved a swath through the previously impenetrable defenses. Fortifications that had been considered safe for months were reduced to ash. Smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, obscuring the bodies of soldiers and the twisted remnants of bunkers. Japanese officers struggled to maintain order, shouting commands over the roar of engines and fire. But even the most disciplined men were beginning to falter. The flamethrower tanks pressed on, unstoppable, leaving trails of devastation in their wake. The Japanese defenders, once confident in their fortifications and cunning, were now scattered, hiding, or retreating deeper into the bowels of the island. The Americans had introduced a new form of warfare, one that was as much psychological as it was physical, a weapon that burned not only bodies but spirits, and as the smoke rose, Blackening the sky above Iwo Jima, both sides realized that nothing would ever be the same. The flamethrower tanks were not just machines of war, they were living embodiments of fire and terror, changing the rules of battle forever. The island was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a furnace, and every soldier trapped within it knew the inferno had only just begun. The caves of Iwo Jima had once offered a refuge, a dark labyrinth where Japanese soldiers believed they could defy the world above. Now, those same tunnels had become tombs of smoke and suffocating heat. Thick, choking plumes twisted through the narrow passageways, stinging eyes and searing lungs. Every step forward was uncertain. Every breath was a struggle. Men coughed violently, clawing at the soot in their throats. Hearts hammering as panic began to set in. Corporal Hasegawa pressed his back against the damp rock wall, trying to calm the shaking of his hands. Around him, comrades whimpered softly or cursed under their breath, eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light. The roar of flamethrower tanks above ground reverberated through the tunnels, making the stone walls tremble as if the island itself were alive, intent on crushing them. Shadows danced across their faces as the smoke thickened, flickering orange and black from the flames. Consuming the positions above. It was the heat that terrified them first and unnatural. Crawling heat that seemed to seep into their very bones. They had expected explosions, bullets, and artillery, but fire was different. It was personal. It reached into the deepest corners of the caves, turning their strongholds into ovens. Soldiers who had fought bravely on other islands now found themselves paralyzed, unsure how to move, where to breathe, or if escape was even possible. Lieutenant Nakamura moved cautiously through the main tunnel, his sword gripped tightly in one hand, a flashlight trembling in the other. He had trained his men for months, drilled them to anticipate every possible assault. Yet this was something he had never imagined. He could hear the distant shriek of a flamethrower, followed by the sickening crackle of flames meeting wood and rock. The sound was like fire itself screaming. A sudden cry from deeper in the tunnel froze him. One of the younger soldiers, barely more than a boy, had stumbled into a side passage and emerged coughing, eyes wide with terror. It's coming everywhere," the boy choked out, pointing toward the mouth of the tunnel. Nakamura's chest tightened. He had seen the reports, the whispered stories of entire caves consumed by fire, of men trapped with no hope of escape. Now he understood the reports were not exaggeration. They were warnings. From above, the flamethrower tanks continued their advance. Every burst of fire sent vibrations through the stone beneath, rattling helmets and rattling nerves. Smoke seeped into every crevice, curling around bodies and forcing soldiers to retreat further into the darkness. Attempts to counter the tanks with grenades or sniper fire were futile. The machines were armored, relentless, and methodical, their operators precise and coldly focused. In one cramped chamber, Sergeant Tanaka tried to rally his men. "We hold, we survive. Do not give in to fear." His voice was firm, but it barely carried over the roar and hiss of fire above. The men obeyed, but the determination in their eyes wavered. Each moment that passed, each flare of fire that illuminated the tunnel walls, reminded them of their vulnerability. Even a single lapse could mean death. The smoke brought other terrors as well. Shadows twisted in the flickering light, making familiar walls seem like monsters ready to strike. Whispers echoed through the tunnel, some real, some imagined, feeding paranoia and despair. Soldiers stumbled over supplies, over fallen comrades, even over the very rocks that had once seemed secure underfoot. In the smoke, every sound was amplified, a coughing fit, a clatter of equipment, the distant roar of fire. Every noise became a threat. Every shadow a potential death waiting to strike. Corporal Hasegawa crawled along a side tunnel, the heat pressing against him like a living force. He could hear the panicked breathing of men ahead, the low groans of the wounded, and the frantic whispers of those who had lost hope. He thought of his family, of home, of a life that now seemed impossibly distant. Fear gnawed at him, primal and relentless, yet he forced himself forward, guided only by instinct and a desperate will to survive. Outside, the tanks paused only briefly before pressing onward again. Streams of fire leapt into the mouths of caves, turning entrances into roaring infernos. Japanese soldiers scrambled, some surrendering their positions, others retreating deeper, hoping to find a hidden escape route. Yet every tunnel seemed to lead only to more smoke, more heat, more suffocating darkness. Lieutenant Nakamura finally reached a junction where several tunnels converged. He paused, trying to assess the situation, but the smoke made it impossible to see even a few feet ahead. The cries of men, mingled with the hiss of fire, created a symphony of terror that pressed on his mind. He realized, with a sinking horror, that even the most disciplined soldiers were now shadows of themselves, fighting not only the enemy, but the instinctive panic that the flames had ignited. Small acts of courage punctuated the fear. One soldier dragged a wounded comrade toward a side exit. Another used a makeshift barrier to shield a group of men from a sudden flare of fire. These acts were brief, fragile sparks of humanity in a landscape consumed by smoke and shadows. But for every act of bravery, the fire seemed to push further, leaving despair in its wake. As night began to fall over Iwo Jima, the flames above continued their relentless advance. Smoke thickened in the tunnels, turning corridors into disorienting mazes. Japanese soldiers huddled in corners, trembling, hearts racing, each breath a struggle. They were trapped between stone and flame, between hope and the terror that had settled deep in their bones. Lieutenant Nakamura closed his eyes briefly, listening to the roar and hiss above. He knew that survival would demand more than courage. It would demand ingenuity, resilience, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Yet even he could not deny the truth. The island had become a furnace, and the fire would not stop until it had consumed everything in its path. In the suffocating darkness, with shadows stretching like predators along the walls, one thought haunted every man. The enemy was not just the soldiers above, they were the fire itself. A living, breathing nightmare that left no refuge, no safety, and no escape. And the worst was yet to come. The fire above ground raged with relentless fury. But in the tunnels and rocky ridges of Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers refused to surrender without a fight. Smoke still curled from the shattered bunkers, casting eerie shadows across the jagged terrain, but the men dug in, using every trick they had mastered over months of preparation. Hidden tunnels, camouflaged pits, and improvised traps became weapons against the unstoppable advance of the American flamethrower tanks. Corporal Hasegawa moved silently through a narrow passage, carrying grenades and bundles of explosives. He paused, listening to the roar of engines and the hiss of fire above. Every second counted. The tanks might be impervious to bullets, but a well-placed charge or a sudden ambush could slow their progress or at least force them into temporary retreat. He signaled to a small group of men, and they carefully prepared a trap in a choke point where the rocky ridge funneled the tank's advance, above ground. Lieutenant Parker sensed resistance. The flamethrower tank's progress was rapid but not unopposed. Japanese machine gun nests fired from unexpected angles, striking the tank's less protected sides. Some tanks hesitated, caught in the kill zone, while infantrymen darted between rocks and fire, attempting to harass the American advance. Parker barked orders and his crew adjusted the turret, unleashing a torrent of flame that reduced the hiding spots to smoldering rubble. Still, the Japanese ingenuity was undeniable. Their traps, tunnels, and tactical ambush made the flames' path unpredictable, and every pause brought danger. In a narrow ravine, Sergeant Tanaka had positioned a group of soldiers with explosives primed to collapse part of the hillside. "On my mark," he whispered, sweat dripping down his face, every nerve taut with fear and anticipation. The first tank rumbled into the trap zone, oblivious to the hidden danger. A sudden explosion shook the ground, rocks and debris raining down, and the tank shuddered violently. Men above ground cheered briefly, a spark of hope in the nightmare that surrounded them. But the tank kept moving, armored and unyielding, flames lashing outward as it pressed forward. Elsewhere, Japanese soldiers fired from concealed slit trenches, forcing the American infantry to take cover behind their tanks. The battle was a deadly dance, fire versus fire, steel versus stone, courage against fear. Each ambush bought precious minutes for the defenders. Yet for every small victory, the tanks seemed to recover. Advancing steadily as if propelled by an unbreakable force, Corporal Hasegawa crawled toward a side tunnel exit, carrying a makeshift flamethrower of his own, a crude device fashioned from fuel canisters and piping. He aimed at the approaching American soldiers, hoping to create enough smoke and confusion to protect retreating comrades. The device sputtered, spewing a short burst of flame, but the effect was limited. Yet even this small resistance had an impact, forcing the Americans to momentarily divert attention, scan for hidden threats, and adjust tactics. Lieutenant Nakamura moved between groups of soldiers, shouting orders, trying to coordinate the fragmented defense. Hold the tunnels? Channel them into the choke points. Don't let them take the ridge. His voice carried a mixture of authority and desperation. Soldiers obeyed, setting off more charges, laying ambush, and using every ounce of ingenuity left to them. The fire above might be unstoppable, but battleground. The Japanese would not surrender quietly. In the chaos, the human element of warfare revealed itself. A young soldier shielded a wounded comrade as he crawled through debris-strewn tunnels, risking his life to save another. Another lit a fuse for an explosive, holding his breath as the flames from the tank roared closer, the noise deafening, the heat intense. Courage and fear existed side by side, inseparable. Each man pushed to the edge of endurance. The flamethrower tanks surged forward again, crushing barricades and consuming anything flammable in their path. Yet even as the Americans adapted to the ambush, the Japanese defenders discovered small successes. A tank hit by a collapsing rock wall stalled momentarily, its crew scrambling to regain control. A sudden burst of small arms fire forced one crew to abandon their flamethrower temporarily, retreating under cover of smoke. These moments were fleeting but significant, proof that ingenuity, courage, and desperation could temper even the most overwhelming force. Smoke and fire twisted together, blurring the line between victory and defeat. Every second of delay was precious. Every successful ambush, no matter how small, was a reprieve from the inevitable inferno. Yet the unrelenting advance of the tanks reminded the defenders that these moments were fleeting. Iwo Jima's landscape, scarred and burning, was a testament to the brutal calculus of survival. By late afternoon, the battle had evolved into a grueling test of endurance and willpower. The Japanese had slowed the Americans, but only temporarily. Exhaustion etched itself into the faces of every soldier, smudged with soot, sweat, and the fear that the next moment could be their last. Every tunnel, every ridge, every hidden trap was a gamble, a fragile hope against an enemy armed with fire and steel. Lieutenant Nakamura paused at a junction, listening to the distant roar above, feeling the tremor of the tanks beneath his feet. His men were exhausted, their morale shaken but not broken. He knew that the fight would only intensify, that the flames would push forward relentlessly. The resistance had bought them time, but it had not stopped the inferno. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the burning ridges, every soldier understood the truth. The battle was far from over, and the next hours would demand courage beyond anything they had yet faced. The sun hung low over Iwo Jima, casting long shadows across the scorched landscape. Smoke and flame still twisted above the ridges, but the American flamethrower tanks had pushed relentlessly forward, breaking through the once impenetrable Japanese fortifications. Where stone and wood had promised sanctuary, now there was only fire, rubble, and the echo of despair. The turning point of the battle had arrived. Lieutenant Parker's tank rumbled over a jagged slope, its flamethrower spitting fire into the mouth of a massive cave system. The roar was deafening, the heat unbearable even from several yards away. From within, Japanese soldiers scrambled in frantic disarray, their tunnels no longer hiding them, their weapons unable to match the inferno. Smoke choked their lungs. Fear paralyzed their minds, and for the first time, they faced the undeniable truth. Their defenses were collapsing. Sergeant Tanaka, commanding a small group of soldiers near the northern ridge, shouted orders that were drowned out by the roar above. "Hold your positions. Don't give in." But the words felt hollow. Men were running from their posts, abandoning carefully laid traps as the fire crept closer. A soldier carrying explosives turned back too late, only to be caught in a burst of flame that turned his bunker into an oven. The screams echoed through the rocky cliffs, haunting those who remained, yet amid the chaos, acts of courage shone. Corporal Hasegawa dragged a wounded comrade from a collapsing tunnel, shielding him with his body as debris and smoke filled the chamber. A young soldier, barely 19, launched a desperate grenade at an advancing tank, buying precious seconds for retreating comrades before succumbing to the smoke himself. These moments were fleeting, fragile sparks in the overwhelming darkness, but they defined the human cost of this inferno. Above ground, the American tanks pressed their advantage. Their operators had mastered the rhythm of the battlefield, advancing strategically to flush out survivors, neutralize machine gun nests, and suppress counterattacks. The flamethrowers were not just weapons, they were psychological instruments, striking terror into every man who opposed them. Japanese soldiers who had once been disciplined, confident, and cunning now staggered through smoke-filled corridors, trapped between rock, fire, and the relentless advance of Steel. Lieutenant Nakamura moved through the remaining tunnels, shouting instructions to any soldiers he could reach. His heart pounded in his chest as he witnessed the devastation firsthand, comrades lost, bunkers destroyed, supplies consumed. Yet he refused to surrender, forcing retreating men to regroup, to channel the enemy into the few defensible positions that remained. Even in defeat, he sought to delay the inevitable, buying time, preserving lives, and fighting for every inch of the island. At the northern ridge, the final bastion of resistance began to crumble. Japanese soldiers who had dug in for months found themselves exposed, their tunnels breached by fire and explosive charges. Smoke and flames poured into every crevice, forcing retreats into smaller, dead-end chambers. Every attempt to counterattack was met with the terrifying roar of the flamethrowers, each burst of fire reducing hope, morale, and life itself from one collapsed tunnel. A soldier's last desperate cry rang out. Corporal Hasegawa, moving through the wreckage, could only drag his comrade's lifeless body to safety. He paused, covered in soot and blood, staring at the advancing tanks above ground. They were machines of destruction, unstoppable in their purpose, and yet somehow, amidst the inferno, he survived. He looked at the young faces of the remaining soldiers and saw the same mixture of fear, disbelief, and grim determination that had carried him this far. By late afternoon, the American strategy had achieved its decisive impact. The flamethrower tanks had not only destroyed physical defenses but had shattered morale, leaving Japanese soldiers scattered, hiding, or surrendering in the few remaining tunnels. What had once been strongholds of hope and discipline had become corridors of smoke and death. Every position breached, every bunker consumed, was a testament to the overwhelming power of this new weapon. Lieutenant Parker observed the battlefield from his tank. The air shimmered with heat, black smoke billowed skyward, and the screams and shouts of men both alive and dying filled the island. He knew that each tank, each advance, had shifted the momentum irreversibly. The Japanese defenses had fought valiantly, but fire and steel had proven superior. Iwo Jima was yielding, not in surrender, but in the undeniable proof of human ingenuity and technological terror combined. Even as victory neared, the human cost was undeniable. Men who had survived this chapter of hell were scarred, physically and emotionally. Many would carry the memory of this day forever, the screams, the heat, the smell of smoke and scorched earth, and the sight of comrades engulfed in flames. Yet for the Americans this turning point meant progress, a foothold on an island that had once seemed unassailable, and a clear path toward eventual victory. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, flames still licked the remaining ridges. The turning point had been achieved, but the battle was far from over. For every bunker destroyed, every tunnel collapsed. The remaining defenders huddled in shadows, planning their next moves, driven by desperation and survival. And for those witnessing it all, the men of both sides, the inferno of Iwo Jima had left an indelible mark, a moment where courage, terror, and fire collided, changing the course of the battle forever. The smoke of battle still clung to the slopes of Iwo Jima, curling over blackened ridges and smoldering bunkers like a grim reminder of what had transpired. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt wood, scorched earth, and the lingering stench of fear. Where Japanese fortifications had once stood, there were now only ruins, tunnels choked with ash, and the silent testimony of lives lost. The flamethrower tanks had moved on, leaving a scar across the island that would not fade with the sun. Corporal Hasegawa staggered through the wreckage, his uniform torn, his face blackened with soot. Around him, the survivors huddled silently, some tending to the wounded, others staring blankly into the distance, trying to process the horror they had just endured. The fires had consumed more than just fortifications. They had devoured confidence, shattered morale, and left the men questioning how such a relentless force could be resisted at all. Lieutenant Nakamura surveyed the remnants of his once proud defensive positions. Crumbled walls, collapsed tunnels, and scorched earth bore witness to the ferocity of the American advance. He had fought with everything he had led his men through ambush and counterattacks, but even his courage and discipline could not withstand the sheer destructive power of the flamethrower tanks. He lowered his head, listening to the faint moans of injured soldiers. Understanding that survival alone was now the measure of success above ground, Lieutenant Parker and his crew checked their tanks, the engines still warm from the relentless advance. They had pressed the attack methodically, combining firepower and psychological warfare to devastating effect. The flamethrower tanks had proven their value not just as weapons of destruction, but as tools that reshaped the battlefield itself. Even hardened Japanese soldiers, trained and disciplined, had been driven to retreat or surrender by the fear they inspired. The island, once a fortified stronghold, now lay open, a landscape transformed by fire. Survivors from both sides moved through the devastation cautiously. American infantry combed the ruins, wary of lingering ambush or hidden explosives. Japanese soldiers emerged from the smoke, some carrying the wounded, others surrendering quietly, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and disbelief. The human toll of the battle was staggering. Men who had fought bravely now faced the aftermath of fire, chaos, and loss. In the tunnels, the wounded were tended as best they could be. Makeshift stretchers carried soldiers who had barely escaped the flames. Some clutched their arms or legs, others were scorched across their faces or torsos. The cries of pain mingled with the lingering hiss of embers, a haunting reminder of how close death had come to every man in the labyrinth of caves. Lieutenant Nakamura moved among them, offering words of reassurance where he could, but understanding that no words could erase the terror they had endured. Even as the fires died down, the psychological impact lingered. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the tank's fire, describing the heat that seemed almost alive, the roar that echoed through tunnels, the moments when hope seemed snatched away by a wall of flame. Those who had survived carried a mix of relief and horror, knowing that the battle had been won or lost not just by bullets and bombs, but by fire itself. The strategic implications of the flamethrower tanks were clear. Military commanders observed how the introduction of these weapons had forced Japanese troops out of their entrenched positions, neutralized strongpoints, and reduced resistance that might otherwise have delayed the American advance. In subsequent battles across the Pacific, flamethrower tanks became a key component of island assaults. Their psychological and tactical impact shaping strategy and rewriting the rules of engagement. Yet for the men on the ground, historical analysis mattered little compared to the immediate aftermath. They had witnessed friends engulfed in fire, heard the screams of the trapped, and felt the heat press against stone and flesh alike. The island was silent now, but the memory of the flames would haunt them forever. Corporal Hasegawa sat on a jagged rock, watching the sun dip toward the horizon, wondering how so much destruction could emerge from so few machines. The fire had won in minutes what months of preparation had struggled to hold. By nightfall, the battlefield was eerily quiet. Smoke still curled in the distance, and the occasional flicker of a lingering ember reminded everyone that the inferno had only recently passed. The men moved cautiously, tending to the wounded, marking positions, and preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Iwo Jima had been breached, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would endure far longer than the battle itself. As Lieutenant Nakamura looked across the charred ridges, he realized the full weight of what had occurred. The flamethrower tanks had not just destroyed fortifications, they had reshaped the very landscape of fear, leaving survivors to grapple with a terror that went beyond weapons, beyond strategy, and beyond the immediate battle. The aftermath was more than smoke and ash. It was the imprint of a new era of warfare, where fire alone could dictate the fate of men, and in that still, haunting twilight, every soldier understood the cost of survival, the relentless power of innovation, and the fragile line between courage and despair. The fire had passed, but its echo lingered, a warning and a memory that would define Iwo Jima long after the last flame died. Years later, long after the smoke had cleared and the scorched ridges of Iwo Jima had quieted, survivors still carried the memory of fire. Letters sent home spoke not only of bravery but of horror, of friends lost in the tunnels, of bunkers swallowed by flame, of moments when the roar of the flamethrower tank seemed to eclipse the sun itself. Every account shared the same refrain: the fire was alive, relentless and unforgettable. Corporal Hasegawa, now older, often recalled the heat that pressed against the stone walls, the shadows that twisted in the smoke, and the faces of men frozen in terror. Even in moments of safety, the memory of flames creeping through the caves lingered, a reminder of the thin line between survival and death. Those who had faced the inferno spoke in whispers, careful not to disturb the echoes of a past that refused to fade. Lieutenant Nakamura reflected on the battle from a distance, pondering not only the tactics and strategies employed, but the human cost. The flamethrower tanks had done more than breach fortifications. They had shattered illusions of invulnerability, reshaped the psychology of warfare, and rewritten the rules of engagement in the Pacific. Where once soldiers had relied on stone, wood, and cunning, fire had proven an unassailable force, reshaping both landscape and morale for the Americans. The flamethrower tanks were a testament to ingenuity under pressure. They had provided a crucial advantage, breaking through positions that months of preparation had made formidable. But for all the tactical success, there was no denying the terror they inflicted, the screams, the smoke, and the searing heat that left survivors forever marked. Courage and fear intertwined, creating a legacy that was as human as it was mechanical. Standing on the now quiet ridges of Iwo Jima, one could see the remnants of the battle, the twisted metal of tanks, crumbled bunkers, and scorched earth. Yet the most enduring scar was not in stone or steel. It was in memory. The fire had passed, but its echo remained, a haunting reminder that in war, terror could be as powerful a weapon as any gun, any bomb, or any soldier. And so Iwo Jima endured in history not just as a battlefield of strategy and valor, but as a place where courage met fear and where flames carved their mark on men, memories, and the course of warfare itself. The echoes of fire lingered, whispering through the ages, a testament to the inferno that had forever changed the island and those who survived it.